For those in the room, you'll hear for the third time that I'm Professor Andrea Forte, and this is the final run. So I'm a professor of human-centered computing. I teach a lot of courses in the HCI UX major. And today I'll be talking about open online collaboration and other dangerous things that people do online. So as I mentioned, I do human-centered research. It means that I think about the use and arrangement and design of technologies that take into account many different facets of human experience. So I don't just think about whether things are the right color or whether things are organized the right way, but also try to understand social aspects of the information systems use outside of the design of the system itself, the context in which people are using systems. So one of the areas that I do a lot of work in is open collaboration. So you may be familiar with that as peer production. When we talk about open collaboration or peer production, we talk about open source software, OpenStreetMap, Internet Archive, even Reddit can be considered a form of open collaboration or a site of open collaboration. And in particular, I do a lot of work looking at how people collaborate on Wikipedia. So open collaboration is this idea that people come together and produce valuable things online in new ways that weren't possible before. So we used to have organizations like companies and firms that helped us organize production of things like software. And then, with peer production, these are examples of people coming together and producing these kinds of valuable goods in the absence of a formal organization like a company. So there's lots of challenges associated with open collaboration. And in my research area, there have been tons of people who have looked at how to help open collaboration organizations do things like attract and keep their volunteers and teach volunteers how to do a good job of producing things, maintaining high quality of software or maps or content on the encyclopedia, if that's what you do. And attracting and keeping volunteers and maintaining high quality artifacts, productions, means having diverse contributors. So in the case of Wikipedia, where as I said, I do a lot of my work, diverse contributors means that you are able to capture a lot of the different kinds of knowledge in the world. So you don't want to have just one type of person writing the most referenced encyclopedia of all time. You want people with a diverse set of backgrounds, many different forms of knowledge coming together to produce things. Oh, I have a question. I have a question in the house. Yes.
So it seems like there's sort of a double-edged sword about this diversity issue with different levels of experience versus, do you let the creationists and flat earthers and anti-vaxxers have their contributions?
So that's absolutely right. And these are the places on Wikipedia where you see a lot of push and pull and a lot of policy development and a lot of community angst around how do we ensure that we are welcoming of people with diverse perspectives and backgrounds, and yet also rigorous with respect to adherence to our policies about needing to have verifiable sources and that sort of thing. And so one of the things, and this is sort of veering a little bit off the topic, but one of the things that I've actually found is that Wikipedia is one of the most conservative places on the internet when it comes to, and I don't mean politically conservative, I mean when it comes to, yes, you have to back things up with a source that people can agree is reputable, right? And so so this is where a lot of the arguments on Wikipedia start to take place. And it's related in the sense that we'll be talking in a few minutes about what happens when people start arguing in online spaces as they're producing valuable things. Thank you. So what is so dangerous about writing an encyclopedia? Or helping build an operating system or map a geographic area? Why am I calling this talk Online Collaboration and Other Dangerous Feats? Well, I will tell you briefly a very sad story. The man who is pictured now on the screen is named Basil Cartabio. He was an open source software developer, a Wikipedia editor, a very well-known one. He founded Creative Commons Syria, and he founded other projects too. For example, the New Palmyra project used high-resolution imagery to create open 3D models of ancient structures that were then, not long afterwards, razed by Daesh. So he was jailed for years. He then disappeared. And finally, it was revealed that he had been executed. And so his activity in trying to make Syrian culture more open and developing this open way of thinking about the production of knowledge contributed to him being a target. And all over the world, there are people who are collaborating online, contributing to information production online, in contexts where they may find themselves in danger locally. This is a very extreme and public example of when that happens, but there are lots of other examples too. And I'll tell you about some of them in a moment. I'll also recognize that the Wikimedia Foundation every year gives out a Wikipedian of the Year award. And maybe 3 years ago or 4 years ago, that award was given out without naming who it was, because the person's contributions, it wasn't Basil, the person's contributions would put them in jeopardy in their home country. And so they were recognized without actually being named to the community.
So sorry, I don't mean to keep sidetracking from station, but so is the inference here that he was jailed related to the work that he did here, or?
Yeah, his activism in trying to establish an open culture ran counter to the principles of those who would have him jailed and executed. And so he put himself to into a position of risk because he wanted to contribute to a world in which knowledge was open and accessible by all. And we've encountered many examples of this in our further work, which I will talk about now. So we did an interview study several years ago to try to understand what are the kinds of privacy concerns that people have, what are their fears when they go online to contribute to projects, even things that seem as mundane or I suppose safe as writing an encyclopedia. And then so we talked to people who we knew were concerned about privacy, people who use Tor, and then we talked to people who contribute to online projects like Wikipedia, who also said that they were concerned about their privacy. And so we recruited these folks through the Tor project blog and Wikimedia lists. Some of you may be asking, what is Tor? So Tor is an anonymity network. It's a free open source software that allows people to browse internet sites without revealing their IP address. So your IP address gives some information about you, for example, where geographically you're located. And by using tools like Tor, people are able to get access to information without their access being able to be traced back to them. So it's used a lot among activists and is used for, as we know, both what we would consider pro-social and also not so pro-social purposes. So, so we sampled people who would have some different experiences of privacy expectations and related fears. We did interviews with, I think 25 people. I have a abridged set of slides here so that I can go through the study a little bit more quickly. We talked to them mainly via Skype, phone, or encrypted audio. There's a clear limitation here because people who are super concerned about their privacy online are less willing to talk through digital channels about their privacy concerns. One person was able to come to Philadelphia and talk to me. And so I only have written notes at their insistence. And so then once we had conducted interviews with all 25 folks, we coded those transcripts, which means we went through and looked for patterns and themes in the kinds of things that people were afraid of. We collapsed these themes into groups. So we tried to figure out how these themes were connected to each other. And then we continued to discuss what we were finding. And what we did find were different kinds of perceived threats and what the perceived sources of those threats were. And then we found out why some people just didn't see any threats. They just weren't worried about contributing to Wikipedia or open source or anything else. So we also found people's strategies for mitigating these perceived threats and risks. So very quickly, the kinds of threats we saw were surveillance, loss of employment or opportunity, the safety of themselves or their loved ones, harassment or intimidation, and reputation loss. And then the sources of those threats came from governments, businesses, and private citizens. So you can see that these threats were distributed across both sets of participants. But the real interesting part here is, so what did these people actually tell us? What are some examples of the kinds of things that they were worried about? So one Tor user speaking about an acquaintance said, well, they busted his door down and they beat the ever-living crap out of him. He was hospitalized for 2.5 weeks. They told him, if you and your family want to live, then you're going to have to stop causing trouble. And they said that to him in his native language. So this is talking about an individual in the United States who was subjected to violence because of their activism concerning political issues in other countries. And this person says, well, I have a family. So after I visited this guy in the hospital, at first I started shaking. I went into a cold sweat. And then I realized, well, I have to take some of my human rights activities into other identities through the Tor network. And so in Wikipedia, we heard, so this is someone who's doing, human rights activism, international human rights activism. And so they're looking for some tools to help them protect themselves. In the second case, we're looking at someone who edits Wikipedia. And they described that they had gotten death threats and that someone said, this was someone in a European country, said that they were told that they would be the victim of a drive-by shooting if they continued the work that they were doing. And so they say, I pulled back from some of that Wikipedia work when I could no longer hide in quite the same way. For a long time, I lived on my own, so it's just my personal risk. But now my wife lives here as well, so I can't take that same risk. So here we see examples of how people who want to contribute online to different kinds of projects, including the encyclopedia, are feeling threatened as a result of that work. And so they end up changing the nature of their participation, as we'll see. So these are the different kinds of concrete things that people said. They were worried that they would have their head photoshopped onto porn, that they would be beaten up, doxxed, shot, they would lose their job, that they wouldn't get into college, that their family would be harmed, and that they would have fake information about them published. And that's not a complete list. But it does give you a sense of the kinds of things that people are thinking before they go click that edit button on Wikipedia. So there were a couple of people who said, well, I'm really not that worried about it. I just don't see it as being a threat to me. And when we asked them about that, they said, well, I'm not particularly interested in things that are controversial. Or I recognize that I'm a member of a privileged class of people who doesn't have to worry about these kinds of things. So one Tor user says, I come at it from a completely privileged position. I'm an employed white male. I have no horse in this race. I have colleagues who get the death threats and the rape threats and all the rest of it. And a Wikipedia editor says, well, I'm in the position, a privileged position of not being interested in topics that would be of interest to, say, the NSA. And being a white American who's probably not at the top of their watch lists to begin with, this person really isn't that worried. Yeah. Yeah.
So what tagged them to be in the study in the first place if they weren't writing on a controversial topic or didn't have any fears? Were they like some sort of control group that you were interviewing?
No, this was a Tor user who was recognizing that although they are are concerned about privacy, that they themselves don't believe that they're going to be a target of malicious activity, or that they're unlikely to be. And they realize that they use Tor, yes, but other people need it more. And the second one was a Wikipedia editor who self-identified as someone who was concerned about privacy, but when it came down to it, said, well, you know, I don't have to worry too much for these reasons. And it was mainly because they believed themselves to be in a privileged position. So these were not uninterested in privacy. These were differently interested in privacy. Most of the folks we talked to—
They didn't feel individually threatened.
Exactly, yeah. Did feel individually threatened. So here we have some examples of how people mitigated those risks. So one person says, I let them know who I am. So this is a woman who edits on Wikipedia. And one thing we found is that women are very likely to be targeted for their contributions, sometimes through harassment, sometimes simply through having their contributions removed. And so this woman says, I let them know who I am, so that way I'm no fun to chase. But then I don't edit topics, like, for example, women's health topics or sexuality. Not because I think I might be wrong about it. I've got my giant obstetrics textbook open right next to me, but I don't want the backlash. So this woman is pre-med. She is the person that you want writing the Wikipedia articles about women's health topics and sexuality, but she won't touch them. Because in order to be active on Wikipedia, she finds that she has to be careful about what kind of topic she touches, so as not to invite harassment and backlash.
So there becomes a form of self-censorship, I guess.
It is exactly a form of self-censorship. Although one can question whether it's self-censorship when it's a response to negative behaviors on the part of online others. So some people modified their participation, and this wasn't uncommon, and other people enacted different degrees of anonymity. So they created multiple accounts, or they asked other people to post for them, or they used tools like Tor. And now this is sort of a bit of the punchline, that you can't actually edit Wikipedia using Tor, the tool I described earlier. It's blocked. So you have to have some identifiability if you want to contribute to the encyclopedia. All right, so the implications of this study, some of the broad things that we started thinking about were that we don't just want to motivate people to volunteer. We're not just incentivizing them or trying to help them develop skills. We're also trying to give them safe, inclusive places to contribute and the tools they need to feel safe when they go to participate. So all of the work that we've been seeing about how do we attract volunteers, how do we get them up to speed, how do we make people care about our project, needs to also include how do we keep people feeling safe when they do so. And we also started to think about this as a new kind of digital divide between those who are in the privileged position to participate, contribute their views, contribute their skills, contribute their knowledge, and use their identities where the system dictates they must, and those whose participation is chilled by censorship, surveillance, or the need to partition off parts of their identity in order to participate at all. So once we had talked to people who were concerned about privacy, we then went back and talked to the internet service providers on whose platforms these people wanted to participate. So we talked to Open Collaboration contributors, and then we went back and talked to organizations that support Open Collaboration. So there were 5 different organizations, and we talked to people at different levels. I can't tell you who the organizations were because we keep that confidential, but they spanned lots of different areas of Open Collaboration projects. So when we talked to these representatives of service providers, they believed that anonymity was important too, but they had a totally different reason for doing so. They thought, well, this helps people get started. If you don't have to create an account, then you can easily start contributing. And that's the value of anonymity. It lowers the barriers. We want to get those volunteers through the door. We want to get them started and get them excited. And so by allowing them to start participating without an account, they can do that. Now, when it came to using Tor, many of the people we talked to didn't even know if Tor was allowed, or whether they blocked it. So they weren't really considering the idea that people might want more fundamental protections against people knowing who they were or to protect their privacy. Another thing that we noticed is that many people didn't really believe that contributors were worried about their organization collecting data. So their contributors might be worried about the government or businesses or those other bad organizations who might be threatening, but they were not worried so much about their own organization because they believed that their own organization was not a threat to people. And finally, they didn't always see that people's identities outside of their role as a contributor to the project might actually shape their experience of the project. So they weren't thinking about who these people were or where they came from or what their experience might be like as a woman or a man or whatever other identities they might hold. They were really just thinking about them as volunteers, contributors, and their needs as a contributor was a low barrier of entry. And that made a lot of sense. So the threat of abuse in terms of like uploading bad data or information to their projects, that was a concern. And so that was a reason not to allow people to have anonymity or some privacy protections while they contributed. And so what ended up, the result was essentially that anonymous participants, however they were allowed, whether it was just by not logging in or not revealing their IP address by using tools like Tor, they were giving a subset of abilities to contribute to the projects. They weren't giving full citizenship, in other words. They were kind of like second-class citizens in the project. And this term was even used by some of the, in some of the materials that we reviewed. Yes.
Did any of the service providers that you interviewed consider a sort of intermediate form of anonymity where it wasn't anonymous to just the service providers, but was anonymous to the other clients? Or did they
I think pretty much all of them had that kind of anonymity. And it is pretty common. I think everyone we talked to allowed people to, for example, contribute without creating an account, which wouldn't allow you to link, contributions to one another, which was a problem for the internet provider or the service provider, because they want to be able to see, oh, if you're contributing data to these, if you're a citizen science project and you have someone contributing different kinds of data, well, we want to see what kind of things you do, so we know what to recommend to you, and so we know what kind of tools to build for you. And so for them, not having people's identity or not being able to connect people to a variety of different contributions was hampering their ability to develop personalization kinds of tools. And they didn't see themselves as a threat. So it doesn't seem like a dire kind of need to be able to contribute anonymously. And there's been other research that's looked at things like, if you want to go and upload the fact that you saw a particular kind of bird migrating in your backyard, well, you're also uploading the location of your backyard, and these things are insidious. A lot of people don't think about this until they have a particular reason to do so, and that's usually because they're threatened in one way or another. And so by doing the first study, we really uncovered those kind of threat models of the people who wanted to contribute. In the second study, we saw the threat models of the people who run the sites, and they really didn't line up very well. But in the third study, we talked to another kind of service provider. We talked to librarians. And what we found was that librarians demonstrated intersectional thinking about privacy. In other words, they took into account the threats that patrons might face beyond their own library institution because of their facets of their identity. So when they were trying to decide about policies and how to handle privacy and security issues in their libraries, they were thinking about things like their patrons' experiences. So do people need an address to get a library card? Well, it depends on your perspective, but a lot of librarians talked about the fact that they want people who are experiencing homelessness to still be able to get access to materials. Should there be armed police at the door or inside the library? Maybe, but the librarians we talked to also talked about the fact that that may seem very off-putting to people who see the police as not there to protect them, but there to interfere with their activities. So, and then should parents have access to kids' library records? Or should parents have the ability to approve kids' activities at the libraries? These were the kinds of questions that were arising, and librarians were thinking about things like, well, how do we make sure that we protect kids? How do we know what the kids' situation is at home? And there were a lot of discussions that librarians had around protecting their patrons' privacy, not just inside the library, but in relationship to the things that were happening outside their doors. So this was stood in contrast to the ways that the internet service providers thought about the people who came to their sites. The library service providers were really thinking about what was happening outside their walls and the reasons why people might be seeking out privacy. So I'm going to start wrapping it up. The reason why I'm so excited about this line of research is because anonymous speech is a fundamental and important aspect of democratic society. So there's this Supreme Court decision from the mid-90s in which it was written that protections for anonymous speech are vital to democratic discourse, allowing dissenters to shield their identity, frees them to express critical minority views. Anonymity is a shield from the tyranny of the majority. So this is a very lofty and I think important goal to have as a system designer, where people are sharing information and building information to allow those who may feel threatened, who may have critical minority views, to participate in those systems and to allow them, to afford them the protections that they need to do so, and yet balance that need with service providers' real perception of threats that bad behavior might take down their projects. We can't have people just adding anything to Wikipedia. There has to be a process for verifying the things that are added, and there have to be checks and balances so that the community can come together and identify when someone is acting in bad faith, and that does happen. So understanding how to design systems that support both of these stakeholder needs is a really interesting area for the future of human-centered computing. And I think part of what we can look to is the strategies of librarians as they manage their policies. So the outcome of this project has been recommendations to designers in the form of talks and papers and a forthcoming book chapter. And so we're really excited about the kind of impact that this work can have on people's ability to participate online. I want to say a special thank you to the Drexel students who worked on these particular projects, and to all those Drexel students out there who have worked on my other projects as well. Wikimedia, NSF, and the Tor project all helped out in different ways with the kind of work that I just described. And then finally, I would like to point out where in our graduate level curriculum you might take courses that would connect to the kind of ideas that I talked about today. So first of all, the Master of Science and Information Foundation course, Information Innovation Through Design Thinking, introduces the whole design process and how we collect relevant stakeholder perspectives and needs as we design computational artifacts. In the HCI UX major, and these could also be electives for other majors, We have Info 590, which is understanding users, user experience research methods. In this class, we learn about things like interviewing and focus groups, surveys, all of the sort of data collection techniques. Well, not all of them, some of the data collection techniques that I talked about today and more. And then in Info 616, social and collaborative computing, we talk about the kinds of systems that support collaborative production of things like encyclopedias, open source, and many other things. There are also electives. Computer science has a privacy class that is wonderful. And in information science, we also have an information policy and ethics class. So there's a little sample of the kind of courses you might be interested in taking if you're interested in the kind of work that I talked about today. So thank you. And oops, I never put in my email. My email is aforte@Drexel if you'd like to get in touch with further questions.